Hey, welcome to the Wellbeing Show. I'm your host, Noel McDermott. I'm joined this evening by somebody who's been on the show before, but not for a long time. It feels like a sort of a world ago, a lifetime ago, pre-pandemic relationship, and now post-pandemic relationship. Rina Bajaj, did I say that right?
Yeah, Bajaj. Yeah, it's great.
Um, and um, and it's great to have you back. And it's great that you are back. I mean, it's sort of very seriously, it's been a very serious and challenging year. So it's good to see you with us and healthy. And we'll get into having a chat with Rina very shortly. Just to remind you, this is a live streamed show if you're listening to it on a Wednesday evening around about sort of 9 o'clock UK time, whatever your equivalent is around the world. And in that case, please do join us. Comment on one of the platforms we're on, which are Facebook Live, YouTube, and Twitter, I think, at the moment. And it'd be great to hear from you. My team will be scanning the airwaves to look for your comments, or you can give me a call. +44 7506 319 745. And if you're dialing from outside the UK, you can use WhatsApp and send me a message and stuff like that. So if I seem confused at times, it's because I'm looking at a message and trying to engage with you. And we know it's a disaster, guys, trying to do two things at once. So but I'll hand over to Rina and she'll sort of competently take over and sort of manage everything for us while I fumble the ball.
No pressure.
It's lovely to see you again. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. I think, yeah, just reflecting on what you're saying there, the last time I saw you, I think it was over 2 years ago, in a face-to-face capacity. And
2 years ago?
think so, yeah. And
studio, that's right. In those
um,
days when you could sort of cram into a tiny space, because it was tiny, smelly, horrible place.
so it does feel like a lifetime ago. And I think, yeah, so much has happened and so much has changed over the last year for everybody.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been a really unique experience that in some ways we've all gone through together, but in other ways with very individual journeys.
Yeah. So what's it been like for you? Can you remember back to, it was this time last year, wasn't it? When,
Yeah. So I actually remember the kind of day before I was in a school delivering kind of a program. Life seemed quite normal, traveling into London. And it felt like things, well, they did, but it felt like things literally changed overnight. And I think initially, if I think back, it was really scary. The not knowing, I've never experienced anything like this in my lifetime. So to think about even the concept of a lockdown, what did that actually mean? What was going to happen? So lots of uncertainty. Also with work, everything I was doing was face to face, whether that was client work or training. So yeah, I think there was lots of uncertainty and probably anxiety quite early on. And yeah, I think it makes us realize that we're all human. And perhaps on some levels, we're not good with uncertainty, at least not initially. So yeah, it took me some time to adjust. And I'd say it's been sort of up and down along the way. And now we're transitioning into kind of a new normal, whatever that is,
yes.
or an adapted normal, whatever that means. And that requires a real mindset shift.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of, it was bringing back some memories for me. I sort of, in the early days, I remember having this sense of this isn't real. This is like some sort of weird film
Yeah.
that I was being part of, which I know is a sort of anxiety stroke trauma response.
Yeah.
World is a sort of dissociative state. Do you remember issues like that, or were patients bringing that to you, clients bringing that to you during those times?
So for me, I think it actually created much more empathy because although, I had clients who'd experienced anxiety, I think feeling the physical symptoms and really understanding what anxiety felt like shifted my whole perspective. And yeah, in terms of kind of people approaching me for therapy, anxiety was definitely something which was quite common and probably still is. Shifts in mood, and I think there's practical changes that come alongside it. So also as a therapist, having to adapt to an online way of working, that required a lot of thinking space in a space where we were actually quite reactive, because I think most of us were in fight or flight and just trying to feel our way through things.
Yeah, I
So, yeah.
definitely. I mean, I've just described it. So, and I still, and I sort of, if I think just over there in one of my cupboards is still some of the food that I bought then, which I've never used because I don't really eat pasta. But for some reason, I went and bought a load of pasta out of fear and stuff like that. And,
Oh my gosh, this is bringing back so many memories. Yeah,
yeah,
pasta, toilet roll,
yeah,
plain flour. Everyone got into baking initially. That was a thing, no flour in the supermarkets. And I think it's just that sense of the potential of not having, and you could really see kind of the survival instinct kick in there,
yes,
because no one knew how long it would take. I think social media or media perhaps wasn't always the most helpful thing in terms of having the up-to-date information, and it can create kind of a sense of overload, so too much information, but also quite a lot of fear. So it was quite high in terms of fear at that point in time, with the not knowing.
And do you remember? I mean, sort of, I'm intrigued by this because I had an interview on radio a few weeks ago with two therapists, and I didn't mention that Rina is a psychotherapist. So I guess I assumed it because she's a mate. So I assumed everybody could read my mind. But counselling
Can't we?
is it counselling psychologist, isn't it?
Just yet.
Which is sort of a specific part of the clinical psychology work, isn't it? So you do.
Yeah, it's similar to, but it's kind of a separate pathway. But we're similar in a sense that we are scientists, practitioners, so we've completed research, but we're also trained in a range of different approaches. So depending upon what clients need, we'll obviously speak to them and work collaboratively to figure out a plan based on kind of the approaches that we know.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. I was talking with these other therapists on this radio interview, and sort of one of them said that it was, this is one of the few experiences she's had where she's literally going through the same life experiences as all her clients.
Yeah.
And that sort of interesting experience. I mean, I wasn't the first time for me, but I get what she's talking about. And do you resonate with that?
Definitely. I think being the helper whilst you're trying to help yourself was a very different experience, particularly also because usually when you are going through something, the clients that you work with don't know you're going through that. But how could you not name the experience of the pandemic when we're all going through that as a worldwide event? So that was such an interesting experience. And I also work with a lot of kind of other key workers and frontline workers like teachers and head teachers and a lot of education staff. So there was the sense of, how do you take care of yourself whilst you might be struggling, or you might have days where emotions can hit you as well. And actually you're there to support others in your role. So it was an interesting balancing act, and sometimes it worked well and other times it didn't quite work so well. So yeah, I think that was interesting, the fact that we have been through this together and we still are to some extent. So clients will look to you to think about how they can take care of themselves, but also you might be struggling at the same time, which is quite unique.
So did you find yourself sort of modeling back to clients some of the sort of strategies that you were using yourself and going, well, I've tried this, how about why don't you try it, and stuff like that?
Yeah, I would say so, but also just normalizing a range of emotions. Because actually it was challenging. It is quite scary. There are things that we don't know. So I think even hearing that back helps to normalize that it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling. And I think the difference is, even if people had great coping strategies, with how things were shut down, it sometimes made it more difficult to do the things that we normally would do.
The resilience work you normally ask people to do. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because I think that's really important. It's still with us, that issue, because resilience is about the external stuff around us. I'm getting a message from James about my microphone. I've just moved it, James. Is it better now? Message me back, please. I can't be bothered to text him. So James is the techie I've got in the background for those that are just sort of watching. Yes, better, it says, thanks. The resilience stuff, I want to come back to another word you use, which I think is very, very important. And I sort of get your understanding of that word, what it means for you, but also why it's important. And that's the word normalize the experience. So
Yeah.
do you mind talking about that a bit? Because I think it is a really important concept that a lot of people could find very helpful to understand.
Sure. I mean, I think sometimes we think of certain emotions as being good or bad, and I don't think personally it's helpful to view emotions in that way. I think emotions tell us something around what's going on for us,
Yeah.
but also what we might need. So I suppose when we normalize emotions, we're saying that any emotion is okay. We can choose a range of different behaviors to express our emotions, and that maybe that's a bit to work on. But emotions in themselves for me are not good or bad. They're all okay. So it's okay to feel whatever you feel. You know, we all have mental health and sometimes this fluctuates, and that's okay too. So, you know, I think it's really important to have a space, which is what I do on my IG Live as well, just a space to talk. Because I think when you can hear real stories, you recognize that you might not be the only person going through that emotion, or having that feeling or reacting in that way. So it's really about um, opening up discussions and challenging stigma as well.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there's something in it as well for me. There's something about this experience of feeling anxious because you're in the middle of a pandemic. It's not a sign that you're ill. It's a sign that you're healthy and you're functioning.
Yeah, particularly when you think of anxiety, you know, anxiety is a normal reaction to feeling unsafe or feeling under threat. So, you know, anxiety in certain situations like a pandemic is an appropriate response.
Absolutely.
It makes sense.
And also, this people, a lot of people are asking at the time, why is everybody buying toilet paper? It was simply a fight-flight response.
Yeah, yeah,
That's what it was. It was fear there wasn't enough of something, and so people stocked up as though they were going into a winter, which
yeah,
is,
definitely.
you know,
Yeah,
understanding those things, because I think there is something around, isn't there, about when we experience something abnormal within ourselves, we can tend to, as you say, label it as negative and bad and as illness. And it's not always illness. So I think of something like grief, for example.
yeah,
If you're bereaved of somebody that you love, it would be odd if you didn't have strong feelings about that experience. You know, you may not initially, because numbness is often part of the first response, but then to have, you know, desperate feelings of loss or anger
yeah,
or sort of at times overwhelmed by love and remembrance, positive memories and stuff like that. That's all part of how somebody's healing from that dreadful
yeah.
experience. So
And trying to make sense of it. And, you know, even if you think about the pandemic, even if we haven't experienced bereavement personally, and I know a lot of people would have, we still experience loss and loss on a profound level. You know, loss of routine, loss of
yeah,
familiarity. There might be practical losses for some people, like a loss of connection, you know, especially if you live by yourself or you're not really connected to many people. So everything that we knew shifted relatively quickly. So as you say, it's not, you know, surprising that people were trying to hold on to things that they could control or things that they could know as a way to try and feel safer.
yeah. And so thinking then about that idea of resilience, that because what's interesting is a lot of therapies, modern therapies, evidence-based therapies, rely on this idea that you can encourage people to go and do resilience behaviors and resilience relationships. And so, as you pointed out, that wasn't really as available, particularly during the first lockdown. And later on, it became much more available. But during the first lockdown in particular, I seem to remember there was a real taking away of all those things that might
Yeah,
provide resilience. So that would be your social networks, your work networks, your school networks, the loved ones, the ability to go and do things that you enjoy, like the cinema or restaurants and all of these treats and stuff like that. All of this stuff was challenged. Now later on, obviously, it became slightly more complex situation where you were able to do certain types of activities, but initially, what impacts do you remember on yourself and other people, and sort of maybe we can talk a little bit about resilience and what that means from your perspective?
So resilience for me, I mean, some of the kind of traditional ways of thinking about it is being able to, bounce back from adversity. For me, resilience is all about coping. So it's not an absence of challenges, it's how we creatively think around how we create support for ourselves. And I think you're right. I think previously we tended to think of resilience as external things that we do, the actions, the behaviors. And I think what had to change was almost a development of internal resilience.
Yeah.
So, our psychological resilience. So, how are we thinking? How are we expressing our emotions or our feelings? How are we regulating them? How are we developing our own coping strategies? So if I can't speak to someone face to face, could I use technology like Zoom? Or could I write things down or journal? Or go, if you notice, kind of a lot of people went back to creative things as well, whether that was baking or art or puzzles. Like puzzles is a new thing. So we had to find other ways to manage and express our emotions, particularly if we couldn't just speak to someone either face to face or on the phone. And I think it required a lot more of an understanding of emotions.
Yeah.
So perhaps, we weren't so good at really understanding and expressing emotions. But, in the last year or so, what's really happened is that mental health has become a part of the agenda. It's something that we're talking about. It's something that we recognize as being really important to our overall well-being. So before, whereas we might have focused on the social elements or, physical health, we recognize that mental health is also important. So hopefully there's been a shift to thinking about our well-being or our health more holistically. Whereas I think previously mental health potentially was more stigmatized, or we'd see it as kind of people needing specialized support. But, we have come to realize that our mental health can fluctuate. It doesn't mean that we're struggling or that we even need an intervention, but it might mean that we need to stop and think about how we take care of ourselves.
Yeah. And did you get that sign? Did you sort of go, I need to think about me and my oxygen mask, as I like to think of it, that thing on the airplane when they say, put the oxygen mask on yourself first. So what occurred to you? What shifts did you have to make, do you think?
Definitely. Because for me, I was working from home and I have been working from home for the last year. So I didn't have that natural separation between work and home before I had a tube journey, which was like an hour or so into London and an hour back. And I used to listen to music, which was my transition in, my transition out. So it was easier to separate work from home. And, that's something I really needed to consider. So I personally journal every day, and I make that a part of my routine. So I have a routine in the morning where I will, journal and just write down my emotions. And then at the end of the day, I kind of reflect on the challenges or the things that went well, because I think it's also important to acknowledge the small wins, the small victories. And sometimes it might just be getting through the day or, having a break. I also try to break up my day by going for a walk or doing some exercise. So I actually bought some equipment and started kind of working out at home because that helped me. And, thinking about when I was 2-4, so things like social media, it can be great, but it can also be overwhelming. I have the habit or can fall into the habit of scrolling at like 11, 12 at night. So for me, it was about how do I put my phone away? How do I stop this cognitive overload? Even at work, it was a chance to just think about how do we connect outside of meetings. So, we reduced the length of our meetings. We just had opportunities to catch up and chat as we would. So, yeah, there was lots of loss around like routine and just being able to interact with people organically. So, I think it was around how I structure my day, because that gave me some containment and some predictability when things could be quite unpredictable. Also thinking about how much work I take on in a day as well. What feels like my limit, what feels like enough.
I mean, my sense of my limits have changed a lot. I mean, this year I've sort of been so much more compassionate with myself, and also making things simpler. So what is actually important and what is not important, and sort of reassessing those things in my life, and I used to have a commute, but I don't miss it at all. I have to say, it's not. I'm really glad I'm not doing it anymore, and I'm not going to be doing it anymore. So on that theme, I guess, of the changes that sort of have been imposed by experience, by life, do you yet have a sense of those that you're going to continue with, and those that the things that you might want to go back to? Because I think there's an odd sense in which people are talking about going back to normal. I have no sense in which that's what's going to happen at all. There is no going back, there's only going forward. I mean, there's a basic rule, I guess. But for you, what are you keeping, what are you letting go of, do you think?
Also, for me, I think I don't miss the commute either. So I'll be thinking about kind of how much I do that. I mean, it might be that it's not every day. It might be that it's a couple of days a week, and then I will still continue to see clients online as well. I think in terms of, it's interesting you raise this, because I was actually just thinking about that, and the transition back. I think there's this expectation that it creates that everyone's going to want to rush back to what they were doing before. But I think what this year has forced people to do is to stop and reflect. As you say, how was I living? What was my quality of life? What's important to me right now? What makes me feel good? What energizes me? And for me, actually, kind of working flat out, that's not something that energizes me. So for me, it's going to be a boundary around the hours that I work, or maybe the days that I work, and having some space to reflect. I will kind of go back to the socializing element, but also for me, there's questions around expectations. The question I'll be asking myself is, am I doing this because I really want to, or am I doing this because I feel like I should be doing this? And that's about being authentic and true, and listening into what your emotions and your thoughts are telling you.
And coming back, I think, to that notion that you brought up, that death has been in the air, either in a real sense or in another sense, that we've been, I suppose, confronted by an existential experience. Existential meaning our own existence has been, to some extent, put at risk. And it would be pretty normal at that point in those existential experiences to look at priorities. Sort of one of my priorities that changed was focusing on those relationships that were very important to me. And because I had a limited number of choices, you're only allowed to hug a certain number of people, and all, which was such a bizarre thing to be told. That's like, I still find that the strangest thing in the world is, the government telling me how many people I can touch and hold and all that sort of stuff. Well, so I had one person, which is my son, who lives over in France. So I would save all my hugs and kisses for him when I go to see him. And it sort of clarified for me. It was an absolute clarity about, right, I'm only allowed a certain number of people I can do this with. He's the one I'm going to do it with. And that became so important to me. Do you have similar types of experiences of like really focusing on?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you recognize that your time, your energy is actually really important. So for me, I think also, for me, you talk about priorities, and I think for me, one of the questions were, right, where do I want to invest my time and energy? Which relationships are important? Which relationships are actually mutual? Which relationships are based on a solid foundation? Who do I feel free with? Who can I be myself with? Who can I be vulnerable with? Because I think you could pretty much go out with most people and have a good time. But when it comes to, I suppose we had a year of crisis to some extent, where we're all going through something together. For me, it's around, right, what's emotional safety for me? And I think that just helped me to readjust which relationships my energy goes to, and where I might pull back or just see it slightly different. So yeah, when you don't have the distraction of going out, going to a restaurant, going out, doing something else, you kind of realize the depth of your relationships.
I mean, there is something to be said, isn't there, for having a limited set of choices. I mean, I suppose we've known this for a long time. We live in a culture at the moment, in our culture in the UK and in sort of wealthy countries like ours, of in many ways, we are making lifestyle choices based upon affluence, which are killing us. And so most of the physical illnesses that are killing us, heart disease, cancers, etc., are perfectly preventable, but are based upon lifestyle choices. And there's been something about having that stripped away and getting back to, for a certain cohort of the population, become very, very healthy, and others not so, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's something there about what is real connection.
Sure.
So, actually, was it a distraction? Was it something to do? Was it something that made you feel temporarily good? And I think having to really look at your feelings and your emotions and process them, that's really hard. But actually, it can be quite freeing as well, because you know the reason why you're doing certain things. And there still might be friends that are kind of connected through what you do together or your shared interests, and that's okay. But I think it's making more conscious decisions around what's going to work for you in your life on a genuine level.
Absolutely. And I guess these themes have been coming up in terms of the clinical work and what your clients are bringing in. I mean, what sort of things are you typically seeing then, do you think? Can you categorize them?
Yeah, so anxiety is definitely one. Changes in mood, so kind of low mood. I deal a lot with trauma. So I think that can vary depending upon, it can range from specific incidents that have happened or phobias. Now the transition back, that can create some social anxiety as well. But also relationships. So the relationship with ourselves. So lots of issues around how we feel about ourselves, whether that's self-esteem, self-worth, but also relationships. I think with the pandemic, lots of people's relationships have shifted. If you think about previously and how people might have worked or lived their lives, perhaps you were spending, a few hours with your partner a day, and then to go from that to now having different roles, being in the house pretty much like 24 hours a day without the distractions, that's pretty challenging. So yeah, it can create lots of different emotions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think those things have been sort of really in our faces, and then those people who live alone, experiencing loneliness, and genuine loneliness, and difficulties. There's also, I think, been some gender differences in sort of the responses, because, again, coming back to this notion of resilience, I mean, you had a sort of, when I was talking to you about it, you did that classic thing of, because you're well trained in this, and also I think partly it's due to being a woman as well, is that you described how you had strategies that promoted your resilience and you adapted them to the current situation. Now that's a good sign of somebody who's got resilience. Your people who do that are going to bounce back in some ways. But I would say a lot of guys didn't do that, particularly guys who lived alone, lived on their own, because their resilience strategies revolved around a relatively small number of real world contacts, which just went, work, the pub, football, etc., etc., etc. Have you been seeing that at all? I mean, I sort of the figures on guys struggling are pretty high at the moment.
I definitely say that I've got more male clients that are engaging, and I think people do the best in the best way that they know how to. And sometimes when you can give people information or I suppose evidence-based strategies, so kind of strategies that are sound, it can make the world of difference. So it's not always about sitting in a space and processing lots of emotions. Sometimes it's about, right, what can I do? I understand this is what happens to me. How can I manage that? And I think it can definitely help and change. And, coming back to my IG Live, that's why I've also started that as a way to open up discussions, because I feel that even if people won't speak to you directly or will never engage with a therapist, just hearing about what people have done, like today, that might spark an idea off of someone, and they might say, right, let me try that. Let me see how that feels. Or I'm not the only one experiencing that.
I mean, I have to say, one of the things I've noticed this year, it's the first time I ever remember that the core mental well-being messages have been consistently pumped out daily. which is, pick up the phone, talk to somebody, make as much connection as you can, do some exercise, get some sleep, well, all of that.
Yeah.
There's just this consistent message that's been pumped out across many
Yeah.
channels. And one of the other ones, I think, is stop watching the news.
Limit the amount you kind of watch the news.
I've been actively warning people against watching the news this year in a way that, always I sort of allude to it and say, maybe you don't want to get too involved in current affairs. But this year I found that it's actively harming people.
Definitely. And I think if you do want to watch the news, if that's your choice, then just thinking about when. So actually, if you're heightened and you're feeling in a more kind of reactive state, or you're feeling anxious, is that really going to have a positive impact on your well-being at that point in time? So could you come back to it later? Could you come back to it when you're not in the heightened state? So there's something around what we consciously do, because you could sit and watch the news for the whole day, but what that does is it skews your perspective on the world. So it can amplify the sense that everything's unsafe, everyone's unsafe, we're all going to die, and I think whilst there are real risks, and it's important to keep up to date with that, we need to make an informed choice around, putting those risks into perspective. So actually, there are still things that you can do to stay safe.
When we're in a particularly emotional state, we will filter through that state, and we will find evidence that confirms that state. That's just the way it is. So we're afraid, we're going to find things that make us more afraid. And that's the way it is. And that sort of cognitive reframing stuff that people have to do it's I think, really important. And it's interesting, I think, I don't know what you think about this, but one of the things that has struck me this year as well is hearing the Prime Minister and senior politicians and also senior scientists acknowledge the important role of mental well-being in managing the pandemic. And so, and I think this is particularly around kids and schools in some ways, that message has come across, that there's been a clear understanding that schools do much more than just educate, that they're a core component of the well-being of children, of their development and their growth. And that's been a sort of revolution, actually, I think. I don't think that's too strong to say that.
I think, when we think about children and young people's mental health and well-being, they're not in a vacuum. So there are important systems around them, whether that's family, the community, that includes the online community, schools. And I think, schools have really kind of gone through a lot, the intensity of the last year. And we come back to this dichotomy of being the helper and helping. But the thing is now, I think there's something around how we help schools to heal and give children and young people the space to do that. So rather than rushing back into focusing on the academics, which are important, in order for children and young people to learn, they need to feel like they're in a safe place and a safe emotional place. Nothing's going to go in if they're still heightened or it feels unsafe or there's a pressure to succeed, because children and young people have lost out on a lot in the last year as well. So we need to spend a bit of time helping them to transition. And I think there needs to be more of an investment as well from the government. I think there's an acknowledgement, which is great. And the next step is, okay, how do we support that? Because the research is showing that there's going to be an increase in mental health needs, and the earlier we can intervene, the better. But we also need to intervene to support the systems around the children and young people. So what support services are available for parents? What support services are available for school staff? And there's some great charities out there who are doing some great work, but we need to make them kind of more universally available.
So are you an advocate of this idea that's been going around sort of looking at the curriculum and making sure that it's a mental well-being curriculum that may involve, it probably will involve some formal psych education, but also looking at the developmental loss that's happened and prioritizing that rather than the educational sort of curriculum, the A levels, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, if we look at a business case for the academics, you need to do the emotional work first. So it goes hand in hand. And yeah, I would, so PSHE, RSHE, RSE. The great thing is it's now, a statutory obligation that schools do talk about mental health and well-being. And I'm definitely for that, because I think, if we think about normalizing again, the earlier we do that, actually, perhaps there'll be less children who need more specialized support. And this is about a confidence to think about your emotions and think about what you need. And I think this is setting a good precedent for asking for support later on in life too. So yeah, I'm all for it.
It's also, I think that there's been an unfortunate model of practice through children's mental health services, CAMS, of treatment. But of course, treatment happens too far down the line, doesn't it? It's when somebody's really suffering that they get treatment. And so a treatment-based model, although this may seem insane to the public, is a highly dysfunctional model. It's a deficit-based model. And what you're suggesting is more of an asset-based model, which is early intervention, prevention, and I guess services on site. I was getting that impression.
Yeah. So there is, there is kind of linked in with the green paper, a sense that, there will be mental health support teams and education mental health practitioners who will be the bridge between CAMS and schools. So I think we need both, but I think in order to kind of, CAMS, they work so hard as well, and there's a massive backlog. So I think this isn't about kind of bashing CAMS, saying they're not doing a good enough job, but there will still be children that need specialized support. I think the issue is right now there's not enough in between. So, what about children that don't meet the threshold? What support can we offer them? And actually, they might not need to meet a threshold. They might not need to present in crisis if we can work with families and work with children early on. And hopefully, kind of the mental health support will help with that.
Thresholds as a concept is the most destructive concept around children, full stop. And I come at that from a sort of social services management perspective as well, because I was social services manager for 15 years. And the idea that there's a threshold at which you protect children is bonkers.
Yeah.
It should be embedded every day.
Definitely.
It should be happening all the time, every single day. So it's sort of, I know what you're saying about let's not bash CAMS, and I don't intend to do that. But I think it has been an inappropriate model historically, and it still is.
Yeah, and I think the CAMS workers will agree with that. They're under a lot of pressure themselves. We need to kind of think about mental health and wellbeing more holistically, think about children and young people more individually, rather than trying to fit them into the services that are available. So we need to be thinking about what we need moving forward, because the need will go up. But then also, I think alongside that, thinking about adults and staff, what we're doing to help them.
That was going to be my next point. Sort of, I think one of the issues I've had about the treatment available for children is that, in a sense, it makes them the bearer of things that they shouldn't be carrying. So, and often these sort of, I don't know where you're coming from theoretically, but I'm very much of the sort of social construction of mental illness and mental wellness. Sort of mental illness, as we define it, is often, for me, is an expression of really crappy things that have happened to people that shouldn't have happened. And they include sexism, they include homophobia, includes racism, etc., etc. And those things directly produce responses which we call illness, which is debatable as to whether they're illness or not. And I think that happens to children a lot. Because they're a very vulnerable group as a rule, and they can often carry things for organizations and families, which is an expression of that organization or that system's dysfunctional way of working, rather than an illness. And yet we have models that treat an illness in a child as though that's where it is. And then we expect them to go back to that unhealthy system.
And it doesn't change things. The label by itself doesn't change things.
It's absolutely a revolving door, and they just get pathologized more and more and more and more, and end up treatment resistant. and excluded and all that sort of stuff. So that's me a little bit on a soapbox, but I see you nodding. So
yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I'm just thinking about, some of the unhelpful narratives that can come along with that.
yeah.
And how does that child internalize their diagnosis or their label? Do they then become that because that's all they have told that they are, or
But they
that's
do.
all that they know?
Yeah, absolutely, they do. That's the whole point, isn't it? Children will become where you place them.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's really simple. They will reflect the circumstances that they're in. We all do.
Yeah.
And I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, it has taught us that the environment that we're in has a massive impact on our functioning.
Definitely. Yeah, I would 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
And actually, there is something about I'm just thinking about children, there is something about consistency. So, you can't work in one system alone. So schools could do lots of good things, but then what happens at home? So how are we offering a coordinated approach? So thinking about the environment, thinking about nature, thinking about nurture, and the label.
One thing, this isn't blowing my own trumpet, but it's because of my having sort of been tutored and learned how to do everything through statutory sector services. It's wonderful. I think that the UK is fantastic, and is quite rightly a beacon in many areas of the work that we do, and fantastic stuff, but it's also problematic because it's at times uncoordinated and underfunded in certain areas, and priorities shift and all that sort of stuff. But the models of practice, when we think about them, this idea of integrating practice is there as a model. It's just not always happening.
Yeah.
But it's the ideal, I think. And so certainly my companies, like if we get a kid referred in, I just won't work with a kid on their own. So I'm not going to do that to them. It's just, I completely refuse. And the family have to get involved, or they can leave us alone, because everybody in that system has to change without a doubt.
I would agree. And, I think there's an opportunity to make real changes there. But, people have to be willing to kind of really explore that and sit with that.
Yeah, and so sort of in terms of schools, and you talked about the mental health teams, because it was something that goes back to 2017, I think, was initially when those mental health teams within schools were first talked about and started to be rolled out. And the government's just announced 18 million funding for it,
more. Yeah.
So, I know, I happen to know this is one of the areas that you work in. So tell us a little bit about that and what the thinking is behind those teams and what you think the impact of them can have.
Well, I think it's varied. So this is going to be kind of a national rollout. So they are in some areas, they're not in others. So once again, in terms of access, that will vary. And essentially, they're the bridge between CAMS services, so specialist services, and schools. So that will include, mental health support teams, the makeup will depend on the local area. So in terms of where they sit and who's a part of the mental health support team. But most of them should have a EMHP, so educational mental health practitioner. And what the EMHP will do, or be able to do, both in primary and in secondary schools, is work with pupils at school, or if it's primary school, work with parents. And so that usually tends to cover evidence-based program treatments. So usually around mood, anxiety, and for younger children, behaviour as well, because obviously distress can come out in the form of behaviour. And so they can offer the interventions within the school setting, but they also have kind of a link into CAMS. So if they do recognise that a child needs more specialised support, then they'd be able to kind of build the case for that.
Yeah.
Alongside,
then inform that intervention within CAMS with information about what's going on, so they can contextualise.
Definitely. Yeah. And, you can see it as kind of gaining a more holistic picture of that child and what they might need. Alongside that, they can work with school staff. So whether that's developing training or some group work. So really there's an element where they can create some sort of bespoke intervention depending upon what the school needs. And perhaps, I wouldn't say consultancy, but almost kind of conversation. So they'll be able to kind of notice gaps, and they might be able to find a way to support that as well. So that's the basic premise, but obviously it might look different in different areas.
Well, I guess it needs to look different depending on the area, because the whole point is the environment is what is determining sort of the responses that we're seeing, which we call illness.
Definitely.
I guess we have to sort of be very granular about it. There is this idea of what's called a whole school approach. The philosophy is that. What does that mean, Rina?
So for me, a whole school approach is, how are we thinking about mental health and well-being, and really incorporating that into our ethos as a school. So, for example, when we think about mental health, just as we're thinking about, kind of coping well to struggling, if you like, when we think about kind of a whole school approach, we can be thinking about things that we're just doing for every child within the school, up to more specialist support. So this can include things like assemblies, which talk about mental health, linking in with Children's Mental Health Week, looking at your curriculum and thinking about where are the opportunities to discuss well-being, mapping out the provision within your school for support, but also outside of your school. So it's really that whole school thinking about well-being. So how are we making sure that every child can understand what well-being is, and how are we introducing discussions around mental health?
Yeah, and why is that important that we do that?
Because it comes back to thinking about the normalizing again. Just like physical health, we all have mental health, and if we can cope, we can intervene early. We can also prevent. So prevent, the need for specialist services. And it's, yeah.
There was something I remember seeing. I don't remember which one it was. One of the royal boys, Charles's sons, at a conference. I can't remember who it was. Which one was it? I can't remember their names now. What are their names?
Will and Harry.
Well, it was William. That was it. I think it was William. He was talking about his sort of struggles when he became a parent. He then realised he had PTSD, which is sort of he noticed the pain he was in when he became a father, which is a really interesting experience. But he talked about what he'd been taught, and I wonder if this resonates with you. That sort of mental fitness was what he was trying to achieve as his preventative strategy, in the same way that he might do physical exercise as a way of preventing things happening. You can do mental well-being or mental fitness as a way of preventing or reducing, if it does happen, any period of disabling experience of mental illness.
Yeah, for me, it's more about how do you come back to your equilibrium. So,
Right.
if we think about life, there's going to be ups and downs. Rarely is life like this.
Yeah.
If it's like this, normally it's then at some point coming down. So for me, it's around when you are going through the highs and lows, how do you come back to your equilibrium? How do you come back to your own sense of feeling contained or being able to cope? And I think with mental fitness, that's around, once again, what is it that's going to bring me back to where I need to be or where I feel contained and comfortable? And it's interesting that you're talking about him as an example, because I think one thing that strikes me there is how we can continue to recreate patterns in families, or how children can learn how to cope through the modeling of parents and how they manage stress or anxiety or challenges. But we can always change that. So just because we've done something one way doesn't mean we can't change it. But sometimes something like becoming a parent or a pandemic makes us stop and think about the patterns that we might have created.
It's interesting thinking about them. I don't know them as people. I sort of don't have positive or negative views about it. But I think one of the things that's happened with those two guys in particular in their lives are issues around mental health have been foregrounded, and they've chosen to do that. And I found it interesting and upsetting how Harry's wife was dealt with when she was describing her experience of perinatal depression, and what she thought about that. And it's really interesting, I think, and upsetting the differences that the woman of colour had to the guy who isn't of colour. and sort of the compassion that was shown in one sense, and the lack of compassion that was shown, which I think was intersectionally was a gender and race issue. It wasn't just because often women don't get the appropriate diagnosis or explanation of their experience, particularly during depression and during pregnancy and postpartum.
Yeah. And there can be a lot of shame and guilt around kind of that experiences. So we have like idealized views around what it should be like, and potentially when a woman doesn't feel that way, it can really impact on how we view ourselves and what we think of ourselves. And I think also how we're responded to if we ask for help, that can really shape things.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
I think if you're a young black man in the UK, you will express mental distress or psychological distress in a way that is often labelled in a dangerous way, and the same sort of for young women of colour as well, and the sort of way that's experience and the responses to that. And we know, for example, that guys of colour who are more likely to have the police intervene with a psychotic break than guys who are not of colour, for example. And so these things are going on.
Yeah. Well, we also know that the pandemic, if we look at the research as well, there is evidence, of people from Black and minority ethnic communities experiencing increased isolation. And it's isolation that then impacts on mental health. So that impacts on connectedness, that impacts upon engagement, that impacts upon trust, that impacts upon safety, our moods, our experiences. And so we really need to be kind of thinking about how we are improving access to a range of services. So, how are we making it more accessible? How are we consciously trying to understand someone's experience rather than kind of minimizing it? Do we all have equal access to, to services? Is that the case? And even if you look at, even if you look at kind of the impact of the pandemic and even things like an increase in hate crime, these are real issues that are going to have long-term consequences on mental health and well-being. And so we really need to be proactively talking about this and thinking about this.
Yeah, and it's also how distress is framed, I think. Whether distress is framed, you can have two behaviours which look exactly the same, but because of the filters of the person observing, one form of distress is seen as criminal and the other form of distress is seen as what it is, which is distress, and gets a compassionate response. And those themes are still with us. They haven't gone away. They've been exacerbated, I think, by the pandemic. And one thing that's interesting me and striking me is I'm having a memory of walking through Gillette Square, which is a place close to me where slightly older now, my age, gentlemen from the Caribbean hang out and socialise and chat and sort of have malt and Guinness, and they've only just come back, and it's a really important part of their life is this hanging out together in public and having a laugh, but they haven't been able to do it during the pandemic because it's been illegal. And I sort of wonder about those guys. So you're making me think. I'm wondering about them now and thinking, what on earth happened to you during that time, and sort of what have you been through that this would have been the actual fundamental bonds and connections for these guys.
Yeah, definitely. And I think connection is so important. I think there's going to be many stories like that in terms of, the usual ways that people might have coped or connected being taken away. How do people manage? And I think, we've got to be careful around making assumptions. I think it's really important to be curious about people's experiences.
Yes.
You don't have to agree or know. I'm not going to know your experience, you're not going to know mine, but I can be willing to listen and try and understand. Tell me from your perspective, what's your story? And even that can be really empowering, just to be heard. It's not always about a solution. Sometimes it's just being able to have a voice.
Yeah, I think I'm totally with it. on that one. I mean, I think a good example is looking at things like post-traumatic growth. Now we can we can and should sort of label and diagnose these things, because then we can attach appropriate treatments and things like that. But also, it's an existential experience of a human being, which will change the way they experience themselves in the world, particularly if they get effective treatment, which is available to people. And we should say that you don't have to live with it, but you won't be the same when you come out of the other side of it as you went in, and neither should you be. And that's really important to understand, that it's giving you something, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's why a kind of therapeutic space can be so powerful, because there may not be other places, even if you've got really great connections, where you can explore so openly in a safe way. And I think the non-judgmental nature of therapy is extremely important, because we don't necessarily get that on a day-to-day basis.
And that idea of being interested in stuff rather than labeling it, which is a very sort of meditative response. That idea in sort of mindful meditation, that you're an observer, an interested observer, that doesn't necessarily attach one way or the other, which is a great way of experiencing things, I think, which is it's a sort of counterpoint or to the sort of disassociative experience, which is to shut down. Sort of, I think that mindful experience is, you're still in touch, but you just sort of making you more empowered, I think.
Yeah. And you're not avoiding the processing, but you're doing that in a safe space, because I think when we avoid, it can give quite a lot of power to emotions or feelings or thoughts, and we can take that as fact, but it's not always the case. It helps to create a different perspective, almost like an aerial view of what's going on. So you can pick what works for you, and you can kind of choose to leave things that don't work for you.
Yeah, good. And we're coming to the end of the show. You may not have noticed, we've done a whole hour. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Sort of, it always flies by, I think, this hour. So I want to just look at some of the things that we talked about just before the show, around how our profession has changed and certain things. And it's still early days, but what do you think are the significant shifts, do you think, professionally for us?
Yeah, well, I think prior to the lockdown, my experience was there was quite a lot of resistance to online work. That you couldn't create the same therapeutic space, it wouldn't be safe, you wouldn't get the same results. So there's quite a lot of resistance, and I think having to learn how to navigate working online has been a challenge, but it can be done successfully. I think the face of our profession has changed forever, really. We can't go back to the days where we say it doesn't work, and there's lots of evidence that's being gathered for a range of different approaches. And I think it gives people the flexibility, the choice to choose what works for them. So as long as you're thinking with your client around safety, and explain things like confidentiality, I think it can work really well. And I think it can kind of increase the possibility of people engaging too.
I think so. I mean, I've seen an increase in the franchise, as it were, and we always knew. I have been an advocate of online work for a long time, because I think it's more democratic and it's more empowering. And it also reaches groups of people that have historically been excluded for lots of reasons. So for example, single parents, but single mums in particular, who are afraid of being stigmatized and actually can't leave their kid for an hour or 3 hours to go and see a therapist, an hour journey, and then and so actually being able to turn your computer on and have your baby with you, or your kid or whatever, and still have a therapy is, I think, a lifesaver, to be honest.
And I'm hoping that people can still fit therapy into their lifestyles, even when you do go back to a 9 to 5, if that's what you choose. There is flexibility around then engaging with someone at a time that suits you. So yeah, it gives people options, and it can be done safely. So yeah, I'm all for it.
It's broader as well. Like, I'm thinking about my GP. If they ever expect me to turn up to their bloody surgery again, they can forget it. I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
Like I had a consultation with my GP on the phone when I was over in France seeing my son, And to be honest, if you'd have forced me to make a decision between the health choice, I'd have been with my son, and I wouldn't
Yeah,
have consultation. That's the way it was. That's where my
yeah,
priority was. So
definitely.
please.
And there'll still be people that would prefer to sit in a room with somebody, and same with therapists. And I think it's more about choice. It's about freedom of choice. And yeah, so I think I'm definitely all for it. And I think
Concertina, that interminable debate that would have gone on for the next 10 years about they do
yeah,
online. It's like Concertina hasn't gone, no, we're doing it. Now it's definitely part of the repertoire. What else does it look like going forward? So, and I think that becomes a metaphor, I think, for society, that before we rush back to normal, I think it's really worth taking a bit of time with Rina, because she's really good at it, of sort of just thinking about, is that what you want?
yeah, definitely. Just because the expectation is there doesn't mean it's right for you. And I think that's it. It's about kind of resisting the temptation or the pressure because you think everyone else is doing that. When I can probably, guarantee you that lots of people are questioning now, what does life mean to me? What's actually important? What do I want to keep? What do I want to let go of? And that's okay.
Absolutely. So tell me, just before we finish, what are the range of services and things that you're doing at the moment, and the ways in which people might be able to connect with them?
Yeah, sure. So I do have an Instagram, which is at Dr. Rina Bajaj. And that really is around mental health awareness. So I do lots of IG lives, videos. That's around reaching a range of audiences. But I also have a practice where I see clients individually. So I offer a range of different approaches based on your needs. So the first thing would be to have an assessment or phone call, just to see, why you might want to seek therapy, and then we'll take it from there. So you can always contact me either via my Instagram or my website. And I'm in the process of writing a book as well, which is it's a self-empowerment book, and it's actually all about relationships. So the relationship with yourself and how that influences the relationship with other people. So it's like a 30-day program. So fingers crossed that's going to come out in the next few months or this year at some point in time.
Well, I'm going to look forward to reading that, and maybe you can come back and discuss it with us, and some of the concepts and ideas. It would be really sort of great to hear about that. Are you still working in the schools and supporting and working with teachers and stuff like that, or?
Yeah, but I'm going to move into sort of my own business more. So I do offer training, so corporate training and training to schools. So quite a range. So depending upon what you need, you can get in contact with me.
And I guess you have a website, Rina?
So it's www.rinabajaj, which is RINABAJAJ.com.
Okay, and my team will put that out with all this stuff. It's been a real pleasure to catch up with you, and have a good chin wag about some of the important issues that are going on. It's a genuine pleasure that you're okay, you're healthy, and your life is carrying on, which is good news for you, but also good news for the people that you support. And that I'm glad you've been sensible and looked after your own health during this time. So well done, you.
Thanks so
Really,
much, Noel.
you stay with us. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody else. Thanks for joining us this evening, and I'll see you all next week. We'll be posting this video out so people can use it, but I sort of, for now, it's goodbye, and see you all next week. Bye-bye.